"Ma'am, this boarding lane isn't for you." That's what they said out loud in front of everyone, as two uniformed agents stepped between her and the first-class gate like she was trespassing. No questions asked, no details checked, just the assumption, solid and immediate, that she didn't belong. Not because her pass was invalid, it wasn't. Not because she caused a scene, she hadn't spoken a word. But because she was a black woman standing where they didn't expect one to be. The looks, the murmurs, the half-smile from the attendant who scanned her ticket like it must be fake. "We'll have to verify this with corporate," they said, already motioning for security. And she let them. She stepped aside, said nothing, eyes calm, voice quiet. Because they hadn't just made a mistake, they had no idea how massive it was. Not yet. Ever seen something like this happen? What would you have done in her place? Drop a comment with your thoughts and tell us where you're watching from. If this moment made you stop scrolling, hit like, subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth behind the silence, and stay with us. What comes next will change everything. Vivian Dupree stood quietly in line at Terminal 6 of Monarch International Airport, a place she had passed through dozens of times. But today she wasn't behind security glass or escorted through the executive lanes. She was here alone, incognito, by design. Her sleek beige suit blended into the crowd, tailored but not flashy. Her handbag, though from a limited Milanese brand only CEOs seemed to know, bore no ostentatious logos. Her presence was still, composed, unbothered, and silent, until the man behind her decided she wasn't moving fast enough. "Excuse me," the older, white gentleman barked, brushing past her without waiting for acknowledgement. He waved to the attendant at the priority check-in desk, flashing his frequent flyer badge like a knight presenting his crest. "Let the staff help real first-class travelers first," he added, with a pointed glance toward Vivian, as though her quietude made her invisible, or worse, irrelevant. The attendant, a young woman barely in her 20s, offered a tight smile that faded the moment her eyes landed on Vivian. She didn't correct the man. She didn't ask who was next. Instead, she simply turned to the computer, started scanning his boarding pass, and ignored Vivian altogether. Vivian didn't flinch. She just blinked slowly and looked back down at her wristwatch. She wasn't in a hurry. She was here to see something unfold, to feel it firsthand. After 20 minutes of slow processing and inefficient systems, she finally made her way up. "Good morning," Vivian said gently. The attendant raised an eyebrow. "Final destination?" Her tone had none of the warmth given earlier passengers. Vivian handed over her reservation confirmation without comment. "You don't have TSA pre-check?" the woman asked, eyes narrowing as she scanned. "Your boarding pass didn't register as priority." Vivian's voice remained steady. "I booked priority 1 through a corporate account. Please try again." The woman didn't argue, but the way she pursed her lips as she keyed in the information said everything. She didn't believe her. Finally, the scanner beeped. "It's been updated," the attendant muttered. No apology. Vivian moved to security. Here too, the microaggressions followed like shadows. The guard manning the pre-check lane barely glanced at her credentials before waving her toward the longer line. "This one's for priority." "I know," Vivian said. She held up her pass. The man looked at it, did a double take, and said nothing. Just waved her through. Inside the terminal, the air was thick with travel stress. Monarch had just announced a 5-hour delay on Flight 381 to Geneva. The waiting area was packed, people sprawled across seats, bags open, phone batteries dwindling. Vivian sat alone near Gate 24, legs crossed, posture upright. No phone, just a small leather notebook she occasionally scribbled in. Every so often, she felt their stares. Not curious ones, but questioning. She didn't belong in their mental image of first class. She was too quiet, too calm, too composed. Or maybe, to them, she was simply too black. A man 2 seats over leaned to his partner and whispered, "Think she's an upgrade?" Probably bumped from economy. Vivian smiled faintly but didn't turn. She'd heard worse in boardrooms from people with bigger paychecks and smaller minds. 10 minutes later, the same gate agent who had checked in the older white gentleman began handing out updated vouchers and rerouting information. Vivian approached. "Can you check on seat availability for the next flight to Zurich?" she asked politely. The agent looked her up and down. "That route is limited to business class referrals and platinum-level clients." She didn't even check the system. Vivian pulled out her booking document again and handed it over. The agent stared at it, blinked, and said nothing for several moments. Then, "Please wait while I get a supervisor." There was no smile, no "thank you, Ms. Dupree." No acknowledgement at all. Vivian simply nodded and stepped aside. She knew what this was. She had built an empire decoding patterns of behavior just like this. Money didn't buy you dignity in these spaces. You had to claim it, but not yet. She was here to let the ignorance unfold. As she waited, a man in a designer tracksuit walked up, chuckled, and said to the gate agent, "She giving you trouble?" He pointed to Vivian without even lowering his voice. The agent chuckled back. "No trouble, just confusion." They exchanged a knowing laugh. Vivian turned her head, met both their eyes. Neither spoke again. Her phone vibrated once. A single message: "Report if breach of ethical treatment confirmed." She locked it again. It wasn't time to act. Not yet. Nearby, a family with noisy children knocked over a suitcase, and a flight crew walked briskly past. No one saw the slow flicker in Vivian's eyes. Calculated patience. She wasn't here to correct behavior. She was here to record it. Emotionally. Tactically. Like always. Because no matter how many years passed, people still assumed the woman who didn't raise her voice, didn't carry a designer bag with a logo, and didn't jump in to assert herself, wasn't the person making decisions behind closed doors. They didn't see the power because they were never trained to recognize quiet authority in black skin. But she teach them, gently, meticulously. Soon, Vivian remained seated near gate 24, legs still crossed, notebook closed on her lap, as the surrounding murmur grew louder with each passing minute. The terminal's energy had shifted from annoyed patience to restless irritation. People began pacing, arguing softly with partners, and periodically confronting the harried staff for updates. Yet Vivian, despite being calm and orderly, was treated like a misplaced item in someone else's world. As boarding announcements came through scratchy intercoms for unrelated flights, Vivian rose to approach the counter once again. Her intention was simple: to confirm whether meal accommodations had been updated for her preference noted during booking. She waited behind a young white couple who laughed with the gate agent, who smiled brightly, joked back, and even complimented the woman's luggage. When it was Vivian's turn, the smile vanished. "Yes?" the agent asked, eyes cool. Vivian repeated her request clearly, adding her seat number and booking code. The agent tapped for a moment, then gave a short nod without looking up. Nothing changed. "You'll get whatever's on board." Vivian, ever composed, simply replied, "Understood," then walked back to her seat without protest. But the pattern was undeniable. Warmth had an address in this terminal, and her name wasn't on it. The tension deepened when boarding began for a domestic flight at gate 23, just adjacent to hers. A group of passengers in crisp suits formed an orderly line, while a few late stragglers rushed forward. Vivian stood up briefly to stretch. As she did, a uniformed staff member approached her with an assertive stance and said, "Ma'am, we're not boarding this flight yet. Please return to your seat and wait until your group is called." Vivian turned to him, arching one brow. "I'm not boarding. I'm stretching." His eyes scanned her badge, perhaps expecting her to argue. When she didn't, he added, "Please don't cause confusion." There was no apology. He walked off before she could respond. Vivian watched him disappear around the corner, his body language proud, as if he had diffused a threat. She sat again, silently, but now more eyes followed her than before. A few rows down, a man adjusted his seat to face her more directly, observing her with what felt like practiced skepticism. Two college-age women began whispering while glancing her way. It wasn't loud, but she felt the condensation of assumptions dripping onto her like humidity. Then came the moment that crystallized it. A cluster of first-class passengers had started gathering closer to gate 24's boarding line in anticipation. Vivian, holding her bag lightly, joined the informal cluster, maintaining distance, yet clearly positioned where someone in priority should stand. A gate agent, a different woman this time, walked down the line, scanning faces and passes preemptively, offering pleasantries to those she recognized from the lounge. When she reached Vivian, her tone shifted. "This area is for Group A and B only, ma'am." Vivian responded in her usual calm tone. "That's correct. I'm Group A." The woman narrowed her eyes, almost searching for an excuse. "Are you sure? Can I see your pass again?" Vivian handed it over without hesitation. The woman looked at it, expression unreadable, then returned it. No apology. She turned away and greeted the next man, an older white gentleman in shorts, with a full grin and a "Welcome back, Mr. Hughes. Glad to see you again." Hughes smiled warmly, then leaned toward the agent and nodded subtly toward Vivian. "Everything all right over there?" he asked, in a tone meant to sound protective but came off as patronizing. The agent smirked and said, "Just making sure there are no mix-ups today." Vivian heard it all. She held her silence, but the microblade of humiliation had found flesh. Not rage, not protest, but that unique sting of being questioned, always questioned, because she didn't look the part they had written, cast, and performed for decades. As more passengers joined the boarding cluster, Vivian slowly stepped back from the group. She wasn't retreating. She was watching, observing, taking notes not just in her leather-bound notebook anymore, but deep in memory. She now stood at a deliberate angle, her profile visible, her expression unreadable. That's when the airport concierge arrived, rolling a small cart of refreshments for priority customers. Sparkling waters, citrus snacks, neatly wrapped finger sandwiches. Vivian, clearly within reach, wasn't offered a thing. The concierge poured champagne for a woman seated across from Vivian, someone who had arrived after her, and didn't even make eye contact with her. A man in a navy business suit, already sipping his drink, noticed the omission. He looked at Vivian, then at the staff, then back at Vivian again. His brows creased, but he said nothing. Vivian's presence was now an anomaly. Unexplained, unwanted, unexplained again. She knew exactly what was happening. And more importantly, she knew exactly what would come next. But they didn't. They thought she would continue being silent, invisible, that she would board the flight like everyone else, head low, words soft, eyes down. But Vivian was not that woman. Not today. The last straw in this phase came when an older man accidentally bumped into her bag while squeezing past. "Watch it," he muttered, then added under his breath, "Too many folks trying to play rich." It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Vivian didn't look at him. She looked at her watch. Then she smiled, not with her lips, but with the corners of her eyes. Something had clicked. The pattern had played out just enough. Not too soon, not too late, but just right. The trap was now perfectly set, not for retaliation, but for revelation. The silence she had endured wasn't her defeat. It was her evidence. Vivian remained near gate 24, now slightly behind the cluster of priority passengers as a matter of choice, not submission. She had become the center of an invisible gravity. Well, people noticed her, reacted to her, and made judgments, but few dared to confront her openly. That was until the next round of gate crew rotations arrived. A new agent, tall and lean, with a buzz cut and a clipped tone, approached the boarding cluster. His name tag read D. Warner, and his demeanor suggested a man who had internalized a little too much authority. He looked over the line, then down at his tablet, then back up. His eyes stopped on Vivian. "Ma'am," he said sharply, stepping toward her with no greeting. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Vivian, who had shown her documentation 3 separate times that morning, glanced up slowly. "Certainly," she replied, producing it with the same calm assurance she had used with the others. Warner scanned it. His jaw tensed. "This says Group A priority. But are you sure you're in the right place? There's a lot of movement today, upgrades, reassignments. Some people got bumped without being notified." The implication was clear, and so was the condescension in his tone. Vivian took a breath. "Yes," she said. "I'm in the right place." Warner hesitated, then handed the pass back without a word and moved on. She expected the insult by now, but what followed was worse. A woman standing a few feet away, in pearls and a quilted Chanel jacket, turned to Vivian and said, as if genuinely confused, "Oh, I didn't realize they allowed corporate assistants to board with executives now." Vivian looked at her, expression unreadable. "I didn't realize we still assumed assistants can't fly priority," she said softly, then turned away. But the woman wasn't finished. She leaned toward another passenger and said, just loudly enough for Vivian to hear, "She carries herself too well to be staff, but not quite like management. Maybe she married into something." That got a few chuckles. Vivian ignored them. She knew their type. Small minds behind expensive lenses. Minutes later, Vivian walked to the water station behind the gate desk to refill her bottle. As she bent to press the button, a voice behind her snapped, "That's for crew use only." She turned to see another gate employee. Young, new, and clearly trying to assert himself. Vivian raised her bottle slightly. "It's a public dispenser," she said. "If that's changed, feel free to show me the signage." The young man hesitated, glanced around, then muttered, "Just asking people to be considerate." He walked away before she could respond. Vivian didn't need to argue. She had all she required: patterns, data points, behaviors. No single act was dramatic, but together they painted a perfect mosaic of bias. And bias, in her world, was measurable. Back at her seat, she noted another incident. A mother with 2 teenage sons approached the priority boarding zone. They wore casual clothes, sneakers, hoodies. One boy had a baseball cap on sideways. The agent smiled, scanned their passes, and waved them through. Vivian had nothing against them, of course, but the contrast was jarring. They were not dressed for power. They were not composed. But they were white, and they were waved through with zero hesitation. A fact. A pattern. Not a complaint. Just as the gate clock hit the next 30-minute delay marker, a supervisor finally arrived to address the increasingly tense atmosphere. He wore a pressed navy blazer with gold trim and a nameplate that read Operations Lead Grant. Grant was in his mid-50s, carried himself like someone who enjoyed being obeyed, and exuded the smug energy of a man who'd never had to second-guess his place in the world. As he scanned the crowd, his eyes fell on Vivian. His smile faded, not rudely, but automatically, like he was puzzled she was still there. "Good morning," he said, too loudly. "We're reorganizing some seating due to aircraft adjustments. If I could just reconfirm some priority seating, that'd be helpful." He started down the line, glancing at boarding passes, nodding, moving swiftly. When he reached Vivian, he stopped. "Can I see your confirmation again?" he asked, his voice wrapped in politeness, his eyes wrapped in doubt. Vivian handed it over. Grant reviewed it, then looked at her with something between suspicion and amusement. This ticket was booked through a corporate block. That sometimes happens when companies assign unused miles to staff. "Are you with HR? Legal?" His tone was mild, but the words were needles. "No," Vivian said. "I'm not staff." "Ah," Grant replied, not convinced. "Just making sure there's no mix-up. There was a similar incident last month. Someone from a vendor firm boarded using an old client access code." Vivian met his gaze evenly. "You should review your system protocols. If there's a concern, I recommend addressing it with the company that paid for this seat." Grant gave a tight smile and returned her pass. "Of course," he said and moved on, but not before exchanging a quick glance with Warner, the earlier agent, who nodded back. Vivian returned to her seat once more. The circle of suspicion had fully formed around her now. She wasn't just being excluded. She was being watched. Quietly, persistently, not by accident, not by policy, but by assumption. And that assumption, reinforced by each minor humiliation, was trying to tell her that even when she did everything correctly, traveled right, dressed right, behaved right, she was still outside the narrative, still an interloper in a world she had funded. And that was the moment she decided the silence was over. Vivian's decision to end her silence did not manifest in grand gestures or angry declarations. It began, as all of her most powerful moves did, with observation, precision. She had spent the last hour cataloging behavior, tone of voice, body language, inconsistencies in service, like a scientist logging field data. But the moment that finally opened the next door arrived disguised as yet another routine verification. A woman in her 30s wearing a sharp blazer and carrying a slim silver tablet approached the priority seating area. Her name tag read Danica Client Services. She offered an apologetic smile to the group and cleared her throat. "We've had a discrepancy in the payment gateway for several group bookings today," she began. "If you are part of a corporate account purchase or third-party block, we kindly ask you to reconfirm your method of payment at the desk. This is to ensure your ticket isn't flagged during boarding." Vivian knew the game. She was the only one being watched during that announcement. Everyone else, even those who obviously fit the corporate traveler profile, was left alone. Danica's eyes stopped on Vivian, holding a little longer than necessary, almost inviting a challenge. Vivian didn't give her one. She stood, picked up her leather bag, and made her way to the desk. The agent there, a young man with anxious fingers, looked up as she arrived. "Name?" he asked, already typing. "Vivian Dupree," she answered. His hands paused. His eyes scanned the screen. He said slowly. "Looks like your payment verification didn't go through. It's listed as awaiting third-party clearance." Vivian raised an eyebrow. The ticket was paid in full, in advance, through a secured corporate portal. The agent didn't look convinced. Still, the system flagged it. Sometimes the system doesn't match internal data with external vendor blocks. "We're going to need an alternate method of payment or we'll have to reassign the seat." It wasn't just a request, it was the assumption underneath it. The language said protocol. The tone said suspicion. Vivian reached into her wallet and pulled out a card. Matte black. No numbers on the surface. A Centurion-tier financial instrument backed by one of the most exclusive financial networks in the world. She placed it gently on the counter. The agent's eyes widened for a split second before returning to their practiced neutrality. "Let me try this," he murmured. He ran the card. The terminal blinked twice, then beeped. "Denied." He frowned. "It's been declined," he said. He didn't suggest trying again. Didn't check for a chip reader misread. Didn't reboot the terminal. Just stepped back and crossed his arms. "Do you have another form of payment?" Vivian, without changing expression, pulled out a second card. This one titanium, minimal branding, used exclusively for international portfolio transactions. She placed it down. Same routine, same result. "I don't know what's going on," the agent said now, but there was a slight edge in his voice. "These cards may not be compatible with our system." Vivian leaned in slightly. "Or your system may not be compatible with reality." The young man flushed, unsure how to respond. Danica returned, hovering. "Is there an issue?" "We've attempted 2 alternate payments," the agent said. "All declined." Danica looked at Vivian with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Unfortunately, until we resolve this, we won't be able to hold the seat. We'll need to release it to the standby list." Vivian stared at her. "You're planning to downgrade or remove a fully paid ticket based on internal system confusion, without escalation or verification from your finance team?" Danica gave a shrug masked as customer service. "It's protocol." That word again. Vivian took a breath. Then she said something that made both of them blink. "Fine. Please provide me a printout of your payment discrepancy flag, along with your internal payment reconciliation protocol, and the names of the finance officers assigned to ticket verification for this flight." The agent froze. You don't normally deal with people who understand what a forced transaction audit looks like," Vivian said. "But I do. And since your system has now flagged and denied 2 financial instruments accepted globally without issue, and since your tone has shifted with every one of my responses, I'm beginning to suspect this isn't a technical glitch." Danica's mouth opened, then closed. Vivian wasn't yelling. She wasn't angry. She was deliberate and worse, composed. That kind of calm scared people who thrived on imbalance. The agent mumbled, "Let me get my supervisor." "Please do," Vivian said, folding her hands on the counter. While they waited, a man behind her stepped forward and offered his own card. "I can cover her seat if it's a money thing," he said with a kind, oblivious smile. "No one deserves to be embarrassed like this." Vivian didn't turn. She simply said, "Sir, you're assuming the problem is money. That's the first mistake." He looked confused, but nodded awkwardly and stepped back. The supervisor arrived. He was older, graying at the temples, and visibly more polished. After a quick low-volume exchange with the agent, he turned to Vivian. "Ms. Dupree," he said smoothly, "we've reviewed your file. There was, in fact, a cross-system misalignment between corporate allocations and terminal authorization. We're clearing it now. There's no further action needed." Vivian offered a polite nod. "Thank you. Please make sure your staff receives that update as well." As she walked away, the agent looked pale, the supervisor stern, and Danica gone. Vivian returned to her seat, sat slowly, and opened her notebook. Inside, she wrote one word in capital letters: finance. Then she added two names, Danica and the agent. She underlined each once. Because in her world, the fastest way to measure intention wasn't by words. It was by what happened when money entered the room. And what just happened told her more than any insult ever could. Vivian remained in her seat near the boarding area, back straight, notebook closed, hands folded over her lap. She had already noted the shift in tone the moment the supervisor cleared her payment issue. No one apologized, of course. Apologies required acknowledgement of wrong, and this wasn't the kind of place where people admitted such things, not unless they were forced. But more importantly, a new energy had entered the air. Not of welcome, but of wariness. They didn't know who she was, but now they knew one thing for sure. She wasn't someone easily dismissed. And that frightened them more than open defiance ever could. 10 minutes passed. The announcements overhead cycled through languages, gate changes, and updated departure estimates. Vivian didn't need them. She knew delays often masked larger issues. But her attention wasn't on the flight anymore. It was on the way the narrative around her was shifting. She noticed it begin with the glances, different from the earlier suspicion or disapproval. These were more tactical. The new employee now posted at the boarding lane entrance had been instructed to watch her. She could see it in his posture. He didn't look at her directly, but he never turned his back. He had a clipboard, not digital, but paper, and he wrote things periodically while peeking in her direction. He was too young to disguise it well. Across the room, a woman in a blazer, clearly from internal affairs or security, pretended to check wall-mounted monitors while subtly angling herself to keep Vivian in her periphery. Vivian didn't react. Instead, she stood and walked slowly toward a trash bin to dispose of her empty water cup. As she passed, she caught a glimpse of the clipboard. Her name was on it, or rather, something close. Vivian Dupree, possible misuse of credentials. Misuse. She returned to her seat, no rush in her step, no trace of reaction. But inside, the loop was tightening. They weren't just suspecting her anymore. They had upgraded the level of scrutiny. In their minds, she wasn't just out of place, she might be an imposter. That thought made them more dangerous. Vivian opened her bag and retrieved a small leather folio. Inside was a secondary form of ID, not her government-issued one, but a corporate clearance badge marked with a subtle gold emblem. It had no words on the front, only a chip and a raised design. The kind of identification that meant nothing to frontline staff and everything to those who moved money, policy, and infrastructure behind closed doors. She didn't present it. Not yet. She just kept it ready, because things were escalating. At that moment, a quiet beep sounded from behind the counter. The same supervisor who had cleared her ticket earlier returned with furrowed brows, reading from a printed manifest. He leaned in toward a junior employee and whispered something. The employee nodded, tapped a few keys, and then picked up the phone. Vivian watched as the call was placed, not to the finance team, but to the airport's internal security. She recognized the protocol. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A code was being issued. Passenger Verification Protocol, level yellow. In most systems, that level was reserved for suspected misrepresentation of identity or forged travel credentials. 2 security officers in plain clothes entered the terminal 5 minutes later. They didn't approach Vivian directly. One went to the boarding desk, the other to the lounge entrance nearby. The first officer nodded toward Vivian's direction. The other glanced back and took position near the edge of a row. It was a strategic encirclement, not confrontation, but containment. Vivian slowly placed her folio back in her bag, stood, and walked to the large window overlooking the tarmac. From here, she could see the aircraft, sleek, white-polished. Her aircraft. The irony made her smile, if only for a moment. As she turned back, one of the officers stepped into her path. "Ma'am, may I have a word?" His tone was respectful, measured, but there was no mistaking the intent. Vivian tilted her head. "Of course," she said. He gestured toward a small roped-off space near the corner of the gate. "It'll just take a moment." She followed without protest. Once there, he took out a small scanner. "We've had a few issues with the boarding database today," he said. "Your name has a slight discrepancy in spelling, and for security reasons, we need to revalidate your identity." Vivian handed him her boarding pass and government-issued ID. He looked them over, nodded, then said, "Do you have anything else that confirms your priority one clearance?" "We're showing a flag from our internal system suggesting a mismatch with our expected manifest." Vivian reached slowly into her bag, retrieved the leather folio again, and presented the gold emblem badge. The officer hesitated. He wasn't trained for this level of access. "You'll need to scan that through internal ops," she said gently. "It won't show up in your public clearance tier." He stepped away, scanning the badge into a small handheld device. After a long pause, his eyes widened. The color in his face changed subtly. He returned, slower this time. "I apologize, ma'am. You're clear. Thank you for your cooperation." Vivian accepted the return of her documents, nodded once, and said nothing else. As she walked back to her seat, the staff and officers exchanged whispers. They now knew something was off, but not in the way they originally assumed. The mistake wasn't that she didn't belong. It was that she belonged in a place they had no access to. This changed everything, and yet they had no idea how deep they had already gone. Because now the story wasn't about a mix-up. It was about exposure. She had let them treat her like a fraud. She had let them build a paper trail of doubt. And soon, those documents would make excellent supporting material for the next phase of her plan. Vivian returned to her seat as if nothing had happened, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady. But the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The plainclothes officers, who had only moments before treated her as a potential fraud, now kept their distance, not from courtesy, but from confusion. The boarding agents watched her like one might watch a riddle that had suddenly turned threatening. She had revealed just enough to unsettle them, but not enough to explain who she truly was. That was by design. But as with all systems built on hierarchy and ego, the more one person loses control, the more another will try to seize it. That new challenger came in the form of Mr. Grant, the same operations lead who had questioned her credentials earlier. Now, however, he arrived with a different kind of energy. His steps were brisk, his voice sharper, and his entire demeanor projected a man trying to reassert dominance after it had been undermined. He approached Vivian with a clipboard in hand, flanked by Danica, who now kept her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "M.S. Dupree," Grant began, his voice carefully moderated. "We've been advised by our compliance team to proceed with caution regarding some irregularities in today's flight manifest." Vivian didn't stand. She simply looked at him. "You've already seen my credentials," she replied, "and you've cleared my ticket. Are we having this conversation for procedural reasons or personal ones?" Grant's jaw flexed. "I assure you, this is entirely procedural. However, we are exercising our authority to reassign seating as necessary until full verification is completed through our main systems." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" Grant cleared his throat. "You will be temporarily reassigned to a different seat, business class, until such time as the current matter is resolved." Danica added, "It's only temporary. We just want to ensure there's no confusion before takeoff." Vivian's expression didn't flicker. So despite full payment, active clearance, and security validation, you're now choosing to remove me from a confirmed first-class seat, based on a manifest you yourselves admitted has errors. Grant looked past her for a second, trying to gauge whether any other passengers were watching. This is not a reflection on you personally, ma'am. These things happen. Vivian slowly rose to her feet. Her tone remained even. They don't. Not to others. And especially not with this pattern. Grant stepped forward. Please don't escalate this, he said, now lowering his voice. I'm asking you to cooperate so we can avoid further complications. Complications for whom? Vivian asked. You're speaking as if you're trying to protect the flight, but what you're protecting is your ego. Danika's face turned red, but she said nothing. Grant gestured sharply toward the rear. You'll board with Group C. Your new seat will be assigned at the gate. Vivian didn't move. The silence that followed grew heavy. A few passengers now pretended not to look, but their attention was fixed. Grant mistook her silence for hesitation, and that gave him more confidence than he deserved. If you do not comply, he added with finality, we'll have no choice but to cancel your reservation. Your ticket will be refunded within 7 to 10 business days. Vivian blinked slowly. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out the leather folio again, but instead of handing it over, she simply opened it, turned it slightly, and allowed Grant to see its contents. For the briefest moment, he leaned in. Then his expression changed. Subtly, dangerously, his eyes met hers. That's not an airline credential, he said, as if trying to convince himself. Vivian closed the folio. No, it's not. It's a governing credential. One with oversight authority over commercial transportation partners, including this one. Grant's voice faltered, but pride wouldn't let him back down. Be that as it may, I still have jurisdiction over this gate. Vivian nodded once. Then exercise it wisely. But Grant, like many men who mistake position for power, stepped forward again. Final notice, he said. Either you step back from the boarding queue and accept the reassignment, or we'll proceed with removal. Vivian's eyes didn't move. If that's your decision, she said softly, make it official. Call security. Declare your reason, and put it in writing. Danica looked alarmed now. Grant, realizing how exposed he was becoming, hesitated. But not enough. Escort her from the gate, he snapped at a nearby uniformed guard. The guard, to his credit, looked unsure. Sir, now, Grant barked. The guard moved toward Vivian, clearly uncomfortable, but not stopping. Vivian didn't flinch. She placed her notebook back in her bag, straightened her blazer, and stepped calmly aside. Very well, she said. Let's proceed. The moment hung in the air like static. No one spoke. The entire boarding area had fallen into a heavy silence, not from confusion, but from the undeniable sense that something serious was being mishandled. Vivian was escorted to the corner of the boarding zone where a glass partition separated passengers from operations staff. There she waited, unmoving, her hands folded once more. She didn't need to raise her voice. Grant had just made her case for her, in front of witnesses, in front of records, and worse, for himself. Because while Vivian stood quietly in the corner, Grant was already composing an internal report, one that would soon conflict with flight logs, passenger records, and a badge scan that would trigger a compliance review beyond his understanding. But he didn't know that yet. He still thought this was about ego. Vivian simply waited, with silence, with calm, with a storm coiling quietly behind her eyes. Vivian stood calmly near the glass partition, the low murmur of the boarding zone buzzing behind her like white noise, irrelevant now. Her eyes scanned the area methodically, not nervously, not emotionally, just deliberately. She knew that Grant believed he had ended something. In truth, he had only unlocked the next layer. Every word he had uttered, every command issued, every action taken without due process had been recorded, not by video or social media, but by the one thing that never lied in systems like this, the internal security logs and badge access databases. And the moment he initiated her forced removal, a silent protocol embedded in her badge system had activated. She had designed it herself years ago, quiet escalation, triggered only when three conditions were met: verified ticket interference, public boarding denial, and supervisory overreach. All three had just occurred. Now the response had begun, not from Vivian directly, but from somewhere above. 10 minutes passed. She waited. Passengers boarded. Staff whispered. Danica reappeared near the terminal doors, but no longer made eye contact. The young officer who had previously scanned her badge lingered awkwardly, clearly unsettled. Then came the shift. A black SUV pulled up to the side access corridor adjacent to the boarding terminal. Most travelers didn't even notice, but staff did, and Grant definitely did. Out stepped a man in a charcoal suit and no name tag. Someone who didn't belong to the airport staff, but walked as though every foot of this terminal belonged to him. He carried nothing, spoke to no one, and moved with a level of focus that made even the most senior employees shrink back. Behind him came another, slightly older, female, sharp-eyed, tablet in hand. Together, they made their way toward the glass partition, stopping directly in front of Vivian. The man didn't speak right away. He simply nodded. Vivian gave a soft, near-invisible smile and nodded back. The woman stepped forward. "Ms. Dupree," she said clearly, not loudly, but with perfect articulation, "your access clearance has been validated at Level 1 Executive Override. We're moving to realign current personnel assignments per directive." Grant, now watching from 20 feet away, took 2 steps forward and then hesitated. He couldn't hear what was being said, but he saw Vivian nod once again. The man in the suit then turned, walked toward the counter, and asked calmly, "Who is the gate supervisor for Flight 381? Grant stepped forward. "That would be me," he said, chest tightening. "And you are?" The man handed him a black folio, compact and official looking. Grant opened it, and everything changed. The color in his face drained. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. The woman beside him, eyes wide, leaned in. "Sir," she whispered. But Grant remained frozen, staring at the document that bore a gold-embossed seal he had only seen referenced in internal corporate security trainings, never in person. It was the seal of the Skyline Investment Board, the private financial group that had been quietly purchasing controlling interest in the airline over the last 18 months. A group so exclusive that even most directors didn't know who sat on the board. And below the seal, signed in permanent ink, was the name, Vivian A. Dupree, founding board member, Asset Oversight Division. The same name he had ordered removed from a flight. The same person he had accused of misusing credentials. And now, the woman who had just returned from being escorted away was not only a board-level investor. She was a strategic owner, a final signatory on budgetary decisions that included executive compensation, personnel audits, and yes, operational oversight. Vivian approached, slow, controlled. She stopped beside the man in the suit and looked directly at Grant. "You exercised your authority," she said quietly. "Now I'll exercise mine." The man beside her added, "Effective immediately. Gate operations for Flight 381 are being transferred to interim command pending review." Grant stammered, "I didn't know, no one told me." Vivian cut in, "That's the problem. You didn't ask. You assumed." Around them, the environment changed. Staff no longer smirked. Passengers now paid attention. What had begun as whispers of inconvenience had transformed into silence heavy with realization. Vivian turned toward Danica. "Your actions earlier were noted. I'll be reviewing them further before determining next steps. For now, please step away from the counter." Danica nodded without protest and backed off, lips tightly pressed. Vivian then addressed the remaining staff. "I understand stress. I understand pressure. But what I don't accept is institutional arrogance disguised as protocol. That ends today. Not just here, but across every checkpoint, every flight, every office where someone like me is treated as a deviation instead of a stakeholder." She said it without raising her voice, without drama. Yet the effect was thunderous. The man in the charcoal suit turned back to her. "Would you like us to reassign the flight crew?" Vivian paused, then shook her head. "Not yet. Let them fly. But make sure a full compliance and equity review is initiated before they land." "Yes, ma'am." The woman beside him made a note on her tablet. Vivian turned to walk back toward the boarding lane. Now quiet, no one daring to move out of turn. She scanned her pass one final time. It beeped once, then flashed green. "Welcome aboard, MS." Dupree, the kiosk read. She stepped onto the jet bridge, finally, with the weight of justice behind her, not the loud kind, but the kind that arrives precisely, unflinchingly, and with receipts. Vivian stepped into the jet bridge with the same quiet grace she had maintained from the moment she entered the terminal hours earlier. But now each step echoed with authority. No one stopped her. No one spoke. The silence wasn't born of indifference. It was reverence laced with regret. Behind her, the boarding gate remained in suspended animation, staff frozen in an unfamiliar hierarchy where someone they had dismissed not only outranked them, but had the power to redraw their entire operational structure. As Vivian reached the aircraft door, the flight attendant on duty straightened instinctively. Her badge read A. Hollins, and for a moment she hesitated, unsure whether to treat this passenger as a client, a threat, or something else entirely. Vivian simply offered a calm nod. "Good afternoon," she said. Hollins found her voice. "Welcome aboard, MS. Dupree." Vivian entered the aircraft without pause. The cabin was hushed. News of what had happened at the gate hadn't reached every passenger, but there was a strange undercurrent of awareness. Eyes followed her as she walked the narrow aisle to her seat. 1A, the same seat she had selected intentionally, not for luxury, but for visibility. She took her place, set her bag down with practiced efficiency, and fastened her belt. The gesture wasn't for safety, it was for finality. The choice to sit here was now symbolic. It wasn't a seat anymore, it was a statement. 2 minutes later, the pilot exited the cockpit and approached her seat. "MS. Dupree," he asked, adjusting his cuffs. "Captain Langford," she responded without needing an introduction. "Everything satisfactory?" he asked, the question edged with concern rather than courtesy. Vivian looked him directly in the eye. "The aircraft is sound. The system flying it, less so." Langford nodded slowly. "We've been briefed. Whatever you need while you're on this flight, it's yours." Vivian gave a small, diplomatic smile. "I'm not here to be served. I'm here to be remembered." With that, she returned her gaze to the window. Outside, the gate crew scrambled in silent urgency. 2 black vehicles remained stationed by the terminal entrance. Inside the airport, Grant was no longer speaking. He was reading, his hands trembling as he reviewed a printed document that had just arrived from legal operations. It wasn't a reprimand. It was an immediate suspension, effective the moment Vivian stepped on board. Above the letterhead were 6 words, "On the authority of Skyline Holdings." His name was struck through with a red line. Danica, who had been watching from a distance, checked her tablet and saw her clearance credentials disappear in real time. Her access badge pinged red. She knew what that meant. She backed away from the gate without saying a word. Back on the plane, Vivian opened her notebook again. She turned past the names she had already written, Grant, Danica, Warner, and began a new section titled Course Corrections. Under it, she listed departments: customer service, security training, priority protocols, executive sensitivity awareness. Then, one by one, she drew connecting lines between individuals and the systems that enable them. Not to punish them, but to expose the flow. Bias was never isolated. It was inherited, tolerated, and taught. She was no longer reacting to behavior. She was reconfiguring the structure that produced it. 15 minutes into boarding, another passenger took the seat across the aisle. Middle-aged, white, with a kind of tan that suggested wealth and time. He glanced at her, then did a double take. "You're the one from a gate," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. Vivian didn't flinch. "I am." He smiled tightly. "Quite the scene. You're not, with the airline or something?" She turned slightly toward him. "I fund it." His eyebrows lifted, humor vanishing. "Oh." He didn't speak again. Moments later, the head of onboard services, a woman named Catherine, approached from the front galley. "MS. Dupree," she said, quietly but firmly. The catering team has restocked. Would you like anything from the executive menu? We also have your personal items from the lounge delivered to your seat. Vivian nodded. Tea. No sugar. And I'll need a printed copy of the manifest with crew assignments and service roles for this flight. Catherine didn't blink. Of course. Right away, the plane began its pushback. As the engines roared to life, Vivian remained still. She was not angry. She was focused. Beneath her was a company she had invested in not just financially, but structurally. She had signed the initiative that added inclusive leadership training. She had greenlit the funding for gate upgrades designed to reduce friction for underrepresented travelers. And yet here she was, experiencing the very systems she had paid to improve being misused against her. That wasn't irony. It was evidence. Evidence of how deeply rooted the problem still was. As the plane ascended, the seatbelt sign clicked off. Catherine returned with the manifest. Vivian flipped through it quickly, then turned to page 5. There, under operational discretion clauses, was the note authorizing reassignment of passengers due to visual inconsistency with expected demographics. It was coded language, legalese for prejudice. Her pen moved. She circled it twice, drew a line, and wrote, Terminate clause. Retrain legal for anti-bias framing. Across the aisle, the man who had earlier questioned her now shifted uncomfortably. Forgive me, he said, attempting a second chance, but are you planning to, take action against everyone? Vivian didn't answer immediately. She finished her note, closed the manifest, and looked at him. Not everyone. Just the ones who forgot who pays the bills. He fell silent again. By the time the plane leveled off, the aircraft's internal communication system had already transmitted 2 secure packets to headquarters. One contained the names of all staff involved in the gate incident, the exact timestamps of their actions, and their prior disciplinary history. The second was a real-time notice to all regional operations directors, all client-facing staff to be re-audited under Equity Assurance Code. Priority level red. Directive Vivian A. Dupree. There would be no announcement, no press release, just quiet restructuring. That was always her way. She sipped her tea, leaned back, and opened a new page in her notebook. At the top, she wrote a single line. Next phase begins before landing. Vivian remained in seat 1A as the flight progressed through its cruising altitude, her tea resting untouched on the tray table beside her, her notebook now closed but not forgotten. The tension that once followed her like a shadow had dissipated, replaced by an almost reverent silence that filled the front cabin. She hadn't raised her voice, filed a lawsuit, or made threats. And yet, the entire structure that once tried to erase her had begun quietly folding in on itself, one decision, one name, one directive at a time. Her methods had never been about spectacle. They were about leverage, system design, and timing. And now the system itself had begun to correct its course, not by remorse, but by self-preservation. Back on the ground, while Vivian sat miles above the clouds, the real consequences had started to unspool like threads pulled from a carefully tailored suit. Grant, the former operations lead whose authority had disintegrated in the span of a single confrontation, sat alone in a small conference room inside the airport's administration wing. The walls were beige, the lighting too white, the air too cold, the kind of room not meant for decisions, but for waiting. In front of him lay the temporary suspension order, marked indefinite pending review, with 5 flagged incidents highlighted in yellow, all stemming from a single passenger interaction. Vivian Dupree. His access badge had been disabled, his company email locked. And worst of all, the internal report generated by Skyline Holdings had not been addressed to HR. It had gone directly to the board. That bypass, rare and reserved for only the most serious breaches, meant his future had already been recalculated, and not in his favor. Danica, who had once tried to conceal her insecurity behind protocol and procedure, now sat 2 floors below in a compliance interview, answering questions from a silent auditor with no expression and fewer words. Every reply she gave triggered a follow-up. Every vague justification was met with exact timestamps. The system she had so comfortably relied upon to shield her behavior was now being used as evidence. The irony, of course, was that Vivian had designed the audit algorithm herself. Across the terminal, the young agent who had run Vivian's payment attempts through the system twice, both intentionally and improperly, was reassigned to non-client-facing duties. He hadn't been terminated, but he had been flagged. To observe and report had taken on a new meaning. His behavior, though influenced by his peers, had shown a pattern that the algorithm now recognized. He wouldn't be punished for one mistake, but he would be watched. Elsewhere, training manuals were being rewritten. The outdated clause that allowed demographic deviation reassignment was removed entirely within 2 hours of the flight's departure. The language that once masked prejudice behind operational ambiguity had been flagged for legal review and replaced with new phrasing written by the only person who could rewrite it with authority, Vivian herself. And as part of the revision, all regional gate managers would be required to complete an updated ethics certification program, designed, reviewed, and enforced by the Skyline Equity Oversight Division. 3 guesses who signed off on that division's funding. Back in the air, Vivian opened her email, not on a phone, but on the secure tablet issued to her by her private operations team. A message awaited her from the CEO of the airline's parent company. Subject line: Immediate action requested, regretful developments at Monarch International. She didn't respond. Not yet. She needed the ripples to reach further before she allowed the surface to settle. She needed every corner of the organization to feel the shift, not through punishment, but through correction. She wasn't here to burn the system. She was here to rebuild it in her own image. Halfway through the flight, the captain came over the intercom. His voice was calm, professional. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are cruising comfortably and expect a smooth arrival ahead of schedule. We'd like to thank you for your patience during today's unexpected changes. It was coded language, meant for those who understood what had occurred. Vivian didn't need the acknowledgement. She just appreciated that someone recognized the shift. In the crew galley, 2 of the flight attendants spoke in hushed tones. She really is on the board, one asked. She owns part of the company, the other confirmed. Not just this airline, the holding group. She writes the rules. The first nodded slowly. We treated her like a problem. The second replied, and she responded like a strategist. The weight of that realization would travel further than the flight itself, because soon all 27 hubs under the airline's control would receive a memo detailing incident response restructuring, signed with the initials VAD. And under that memo, several departments would begin rotating leadership, not because of punishment, but because Vivian believed in opportunity, even for those who had failed her. She didn't want vengeance. She wanted clarity. Her leadership philosophy wasn't about fear, it was about accountability. The difference was subtle but seismic. As the plane began its descent, Vivian closed her notebook and placed it into her bag. She looked out the window at the sun-kissed clouds below, each one glowing gold along the edges. The descent wasn't a fall. It was a return. The same way justice, when handled properly, doesn't erupt, it unfolds. A flight attendant approached her one last time. MS. Dupree, is there anything else we can provide before landing? Vivian smiled gently. No, everything has already been delivered. The wheels touched down with a soft hum as Flight 381 completed its descent into the Zurich International Airport, the aircraft gliding smoothly along the runway under an amber-tinted sky. Inside the cabin, seatbelt signs pinged off and the usual rustle of travelers reaching for bags and checking phones began, but in seat 1A, Vivian remained motionless for a few seconds longer. She wasn't stalling, she was sealing. What began as a quiet arrival had become a complete reversal, and now, as she prepared to exit the aircraft, she wasn't leaving behind victory. She was leaving behind a lesson. A few rows back, the man who had earlier questioned her presence sat hunched forward, glancing toward her seat with a mixture of discomfort and something resembling humility. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Vivian could feel the shift in energy around her. It wasn't fear. It was understanding, and that was the goal all along. As she stepped off the aircraft, a member of the Zurich ground team greeted her by name, guiding her toward a private lounge entrance. She declined the offer politely. "I prefer the main terminal today," she said, her tone casual. The employee blinked but obeyed, stepping aside. She wanted visibility, not luxury. That had always been the point, not just to reclaim dignity for herself, but to demonstrate that authority doesn't need to hide behind exclusivity. As she moved through customs, her credentials once again cleared without question. This time, the officer nodded with practiced professionalism and added, "Welcome to Switzerland, MS Dupree." She responded with a simple, "Thank you," then continued on. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, change was already taking root. At Monarch International, Grant sat in his now empty office, packing the last of his belongings into a worn briefcase. No one had come to see him off. No send-off email, just a silence that mirrored the one he had once weaponized against others. But there, in the quiet, something unexpected happened. He opened his inbox one last time and found a message, unsigned but clear. Subject, "What you missed." Attached was a short video clip, internal only, of his own interaction with Vivian at the gate, overlaid with policy excerpts that contradicted his actions in real time. At the end of the clip was a quote, "The greatest leaders are not those who never make mistakes, but those who admit when they've been blind." There was no anger in the message, just a mirror. Danica, too, faced a reckoning of a different kind. She hadn't been fired, but she had been reassigned to a division focused on equity compliance. It was meant to be a correctional path, a second chance. At first, she resented it, but as she began the new training modules designed by Vivian's oversight division, she started to understand the architecture of the system she had participated in. She realized her behavior hadn't been born from cruelty, but from compliance, a passive acceptance of bias as protocol. One evening, after completing a particularly challenging course on subconscious profiling, she drafted a letter. She didn't send it yet, but she wrote it, addressed to Vivian. It began, "You didn't humiliate me. You exposed me, and for that I'm grateful." Back in Zurich, Vivian arrived at her hotel, an unassuming mid-century structure tucked between old stone alleys and modern glass towers. She didn't stay in palaces. She stayed in places that blended in. That's where real influence grew best. Inside her suite, she unpacked slowly, placing her notebook on the desk, her badge in the drawer, and her travel blazer back on its hanger. Then, for the first time in nearly 20 hours, she exhaled. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt centered, balanced. Justice had not been served through rage, but through structure, through systems that had once failed her, but now answered to her. That was the beauty of long games. They didn't require noise, only consistency. Later that night, her assistant sent a brief. 5 regional directors had already implemented her new protocols. Staff retraining dates had been issued. And most remarkably, the CEO himself had requested a private meeting to discuss deeper integrations of oversight practices. Vivian didn't smile at the news. She only wrote back 2 words, "Danica." It wasn't an act of forgiveness. It was a vote of potential. The next morning, as Vivian checked out of her hotel, a staff member approached her hesitantly. "Ma'am," he said, "we don't usually ask this, but I just wanted to say I read your article once about invisible leadership. It stuck with me." Vivian paused, pleasantly surprised. "Thank you. That means a great deal." He nodded and stepped away, clearly nervous. She watched him for a second, then turned toward the door. Outside, the city was awake but calm. No crowds, no reporters, just the regular world, moving at its own pace. Vivian walked with the same posture she had maintained through every trial, upright, aware, unapologetically present, not chasing recognition, but ensuring representation. Before leaving, she sent one final note to her own team. It read, "We don't change minds. We change systems. When the system shifts, the mind follows." Then she put her phone away and stepped into the day. Before you go, let's hear your thoughts. Which moment hit you the hardest in this story? What would you have done if you were in Vivian's place? And by the way, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this story powerful, consider subscribing for more narratives that uncover truth, challenge injustice, and restore dignity where it's been denied. Don't forget to like and share to keep these stories alive.